Hey, good morning, everybody. I mean, we have just one of my favorite topics today, and we've got a CEO. We got Johnathan Grammer, and he is the CEO of the U.S. Carbon Capture. And I'll tell you what, it's kind of fun because we just started chit-chatting before the podcast, and we got a really fun discussion coming up here. Johnathan, thank you for stopping by the podcast.
My pleasure, Steve. Thanks for having me.
We were sitting here talking about what do you were an attorney and then you started with the U.S. Carbon Capture. Tell us a little bit about your attorneys. What were you doing with your experience?
I got out of law school in 2003 in Oklahoma City, and at that time was in general civil litigation. Practiced full-time for 2 years. I did a lot of trial work, a lot of trial prep, and found myself gravitating, as to be expected, being in Oklahoma, much like Texas, into the oil and gas business.
Nice.
And ultimately became a petroleum landman, which is what's dictated most of my career.
Nice. So you got some experience. And was that Oklahoma City by any chance for your law school?
Yes, it was by chance, where I think you went to undergrad, if I'm not
mistaken. Did. Oh, doing some homework. I love that. You're the first Oklahoma City University alumni that I've interviewed. So thank you. As welcome to an alumni.
Likewise.
So after you've got all this experience, what prompted you to get over to the U.S. Carbon Capture, and tell us what you're doing there?
It was about 10 years ago. A great deal of the momentum for carbon capture has just initiated maybe in the last 24 months. But my experience in it began probably about 2012, 2013. I had a group of existing clients in the Texas Panhandle, where I sit currently, that had contacted our office about trying to obtain carbon dioxide for the use in enhanced oil recovery. And at that time, I was completely unfamiliar with CO2's use in the oil business, or that it could be safely stored underground during that process.
Right.
And spent several years after that trying to develop all kinds of different methods for capturing industrial carbon dioxide for either, an enhanced oil recovery, which we can get into that in a minute, its uses, to consider a safe way to store it underground as a byproduct. Ultimately, because it was based on oil prices and several other economic factors, those projects didn't develop, and I shelved that part of my life up until about 2 years ago, when I started meeting other professionals in the oil and gas industry,
right,
that saw the same things that I did, but really believed that the time was coming, out of defense of fossil fuels,
right,
that we were going to have to perhaps put up a solution to continue to use biomatter to make energy and heat, and ultimately incorporated this company, and here we are.
Nice. The hypocrisy, let me just explain again. Both my fans are just kind of tired of hearing this, and that is, we have got to get the lowest cost energy to all disproportionately impacted communities and countries. Everybody has the right to elevate out of poverty. Number one way to do that is low cost, sustainable power. That means using the best that the market will generate. Guess what you got to have? Got to have natural gas. You got to have oil. You got to have these things. Technology is not there yet for the renewables, but I like renewables. Doesn't matter, but let's let the market decide without having subsidies. We'll leave that alone. But now carbon capture really makes sense. Now it's really, you can take the bad things about the fossil fuels and tell us a little bit about that, because capturing that carbon is using it and storing it. It's pretty important.
It's important conceptually, and I think theoretically, and actually practically, it's possible.
Right.
What it also is extremely expensive, and most people don't understand, at least that I've encountered, that carbon dioxide, one, it's naturally occurring. It's a greenhouse gas, which has a horrible stamp to it, but these are necessary components of the atmosphere.
Right.
The level is in fact elevated, but CO2 with the exception of ethanol plants and maybe some gas processing facilities, it does not exist in a pure form. It
Right.
makes up a very small component of effluent in power plants. And carving that component out, the 12 or 14% of that emission plume that is in fact CO2,
Right.
requires an enormous amount of energy, enormous amount of technology. It's extremely expensive. I know we talked about not mentioning tax credits, but that's
Right.
why they're so high, is the
Yep.
cost of separating CO2 out so that
Right.
it can be sequestered is astronomical.
No.
And so it is important. The research and development, the legal regime, the regulatory regime that's required is still,
Right.
I believe, years behind. So it
Right.
is an emerging market. It is possible, it's necessary, but I'm not going to make any misgivings that we're ready to commercially deploy this morning.
Right.
Because we're not.
Well, there are some companies that are leading the charge on carbon capture and storage. CUS, carbon CUS.
CCUS, yeah, carbon
Thank
capture,
you.
utilization, storage, yeah.
Yeah, I went to Oklahoma State before Oklahoma City University, so I've got that excuse going for me.
Sure, no, that's good. Good geology department there. No, there's lots of companies leading the way, and of course, we claim to be one of them. And but the steps are incremental and the effort is large. And there are certain states where it's more readily available to deploy: Wyoming, North Dakota, Louisiana, where
Right.
this has been going on for several years. Illinois, where they've got the Decatur project, Mount Simon Sandstone.
Right.
And yeah, I think a great deal of it's going to be done in Texas. We still have rules pending before the Railroad Commission. We still have primacy issues. We still have common law and statutory laws that need to be codified, addressing pore space ownership, how it's going to affect mineral ownership for subsurface onshore storage. So it's, yeah, there are great leaders and there's great momentum, but there's also great hurdles that still remain. And they're being addressed. Go ahead.
Sorry. Wayne Christensen just got reelected again. Have you had meetings with him to go over any of this?
I haven't personally. It's funny you mentioned that. I have the 60-page proposed Railroad Commission amendments in front of me right now. And we, like so many others, have been going through them over the summer. They have not been, to my understanding, have not been approved yet. They are subject to approval by the EPA.
Right.
And my understanding is it's still pending. I don't know when that's going to be concluded.
Okay. I have a lot of respect for the Railroad Commission and what they've done over all these years. But I wish they'd change their name. I mean, nobody understands in Texas what the Railroad Commission does.
Well, that goes back almost 100 years.
Yep.
I think that comes up every so often. I think, there's sunset provisions with respect to a lot of the state agencies. I think there's been momentum in years past to combine, maybe even the PUC and the Railroad Commission and the Texas Energy Department or something.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of people struggle with why that regulatory body is referenced as such.
Well, when we talk about the goodness of oil and gas, and we talk about we're in an energy crisis around the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that energy crisis around the world, with capturing carbon and setting that putting that into natural gas so that, so you can capture, you can produce more oil. We just had our first tanker go out of the Gulf and head off to Europe to replace Russian oil. So being able to have that kind of thing going on, it's pretty darn cool. And if it takes away the black eye from the fossil fuels by doing this, technologically, Johnathan, I have no idea how carbon is stored. Is it in salt domes? Is it in tanks? How is it normally stored?
Ideally, a saline reservoir is what you're looking for. Saline has a lot of positive effects on carbon dioxide. The number one is that it depletes its buoyancy. Carbon dioxide wants to climb, not run. And that can be problematic when you're looking at underground storage, even though you're going to have ideally thousands and thousands of feet separating it from the fresh water table.
Right.
If you can mix it with any type of solution that's going to deplete that, the better. And saline saltwater reservoirs are probably the best. You can store it in open carbonate formations as well.
Okay.
You're going to want to have, in addition to that, your upper confining zones, your lower confining zones. You want to have a shale seal and anticline, the same things that you're looking for in an underground trap for oil and gas.
Okay.
Going to be necessary for underground storage of CO2 as well.
So commercially, Occidental seems to be leading the charge in the majors, and I love what they're doing in their touting, because they're taking a different direction. And I believe the CEO, she was putting out that it's going to be $1 trillion market, whatever the number was. What's a few trillion anymore between friends with our budgets?
Right.
But it's going to be a huge budget. And I applaud Oxy for their forward thinking on this stuff.
Likewise. And my hope, and I think we're seeing it develop, is that, the fossil fuels industry follows suit. They're essentially, they're taking on carbon emissions, but what they're doing, I think, is rebranding themselves. A great deal of it to alleviate, as we all are, investor pressure, which is an enormous influencer right now, is we're rebranding ourselves in the fossil fuel industry as this is our attack plan. We're bringing, this is the message we're bringing now. If fossil fuels is in fact elevating carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and the global economy has decided that's a problem, we're going to take an overt step. We're going to have a good offense rather than a good defense.
You bring up some great points, Jonathan. You can tell I love talking about energy and everything else. And when you bring this up, BlackRock just lost, I believe it was $1.7 trillion in the first 6 months of this year because of their, and again, I have to fact, pardon?
In their ESG investing?
Yes.
Yeah.
So ESG hypocrisy, BlackRock, Fink had to stand up there and go, rut-row. So now they're taking a look and saying, we're investing back into energy. And that, to me, really says goodness about the oil and gas industry when they come back in and the oil and gas industry is adhering. What do you think about the CEOs giving their money back to the investors? Not like they used to. They used to just take that money and roll on.
At the end of the day, green stamping is only going to get you so far.
Right.
And it's become very popular. It's artificial. At the end of the day, you have to have a company that makes money. And for some reason, it sounds evil to say that, but we're in the business of making money.
Right.
That's what companies do. You increase value for your shareholders.
Right.
If your plan works in an ESG regime, that is outstanding for you.
Right.
But you cannot make that your sole motivating factor. And I think you're going to see some bubbles start to burst. Maybe that's the wrong analogy to use, but waiting for this to bleed out a little bit so we find middle ground. How do you make an ESG model make money, not just do it because it's what's popular? And I think that's probably the intersection we're at right now. Certainly BlackRock is.
And you take a look at the whole market, alternative investments. Everybody's looking to get out of the stock market. We all don't, everybody look at your 401ks and all those, and investing in oil and gas and investing. We need capital in order to, I believe it's $1 trillion, something big number around the world, just to replenish the normal decline curves.
Right.
And so, this investment from like the BlackRocks of the world coming in because of the CO2 capture and what the efforts, from what I'm understanding from what you're doing, will make it easier.
That's right. That's right. And, not to deviate from the topic of the moment, but you mentioned something earlier that I think is worth interjecting now. Is very fortunate in the United States to be able to have such elevated issues to discuss because
Right.
we're a developed market.
Right.
And when you opened up this podcast, the first thing you talked about is you're really concerned about economically available energy for all. Is
Right.
that a vast majority of the planet, or at least a strong minority, is still cooking over an open fire
Right.
and doesn't have readily accessible power and doesn't have the luxury that we have to be sort of, well, we're mandating renewables.
Right.
They just got electrical service to their living quarters in the last 5 years. They're just getting,
Yep.
infrastructure where they can actually have automobiles that burn off of petroleum. And so we really do have a luxurious conversation in the United States that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily have.
Right.
And I think as we're to be patriotic for a moment, we are the beacon of which the
Right.
world calibrates its compass. And what we do here and the policies that we implement, we need to be sensitive and conscious that we're setting policy, I think, for the rest of the world as well, not just the
Yep.
United States. So,
But at COP26 this past year, the world leaders were saying that we still have to stuff renewables down the throats of the folks in the third world or emerging markets.
right.
And that really, we had the benefit of coming up with fossil fuels and getting to our point here. Wouldn't it make sense to let them do the same thing and get them up there? I mean, it would make
Agreed.
sense to me. I don't
Agreed
know.
with. Agreed. Agreed.
So if Oxy seems to have the same thing, is that the kind of message that you're taking to your other clients or getting the word out? I mean, is that what you're trying to share?
Well, when you say clients, it's kind of a different business development model. Most of the discussions that we are initiating are with, I guess you could call them clients, but emitters, which are power plants.
Oh, okay, cool.
Who are not trying to necessarily rebrand themselves. They're trying to preserve the methods by which they're providing energy. And so, for example, in
Yep.
the state of Texas, the crossroads that we're at, certainly you interject what happened during the winter storm,
Right.
is you have a very momentous initiative to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and go completely renewable.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you have an event that illustrates that what we really need is strong, powerful, and reliable energy. So if you're a power plant in the state of Texas, you've got two initiatives being crammed down your throat. One, you've got to increase reliability of your power sources for a growing population,
Right.
the likes of which this state hasn't seen since statehood.
Mhm.
And at the same time, you've got massive pressure to reduce your carbon dioxide emissions. So they're not in a process of rebranding so much as those institutions are really kind of faced with hands up in the air. How are we going to provide
Oh.
long-term reliable power and satisfy this initiative to reduce our carbon dioxide footprint at the same time?
So you're the resource to be able to say, we can help guide you through this process.
You give it to us. We'll develop your carbon capture project. We'll separate it at the base of your emissions stack. We know the people, we know the pipeline routes, and we got the rights to the storage location 30 miles outside of town.
Nice.
We're the answer to your problem. You continue to produce 1,000 megawatts of power, burning
Right.
natural gas and coal. Your carbon dioxide goes down to zero, and your ratepayers are satisfied because in the middle of the summer heat, you're not having to do rolling brownouts.
The light just went off. I absolutely love the orchestration that you can provide to the power companies. That orchestration is phenomenal.
Well, there is the sunshine, and as we talked about before we got going, I'm
Right.
not here selling pie in the sky, save the world, because nobody has that. Nobody.
Right.
I'm not an advocate. I'm a businessman. I like to advocate in my free time.
Right.
There's a flip side to that is how are you going to pay for that? Because our understanding is
Right.
for 1,000 megawatt power plant, you're averaging $65, $70 a megawatt for the
Right.
capture costs. Well, that's 70, 80 million. Some of the project costs are astronomical.
Right.
And therein lies the significance of the 45Q tax credit. of $85 a metric ton. Economically now, as much as we may not like father government saving the day,
Right.
you don't have to pass those costs on to your ratepayers if
Right.
you're a utility company. And without it, I don't really know. If we were to implement carbon capture for power plants and leave it up to the free market, you're going to see power prices higher than you'd believe if I even told you what I think they'd go up to. And it wouldn't make economic sense, and we would be stuck right where we are right now.
Well, Europe is in even a worse energy crisis than we
Oh
are.
yeah. Oh yeah.
And do you think that that's because, you know, the policies that always go over in Europe kind of fold over to the United States 4 or 5 years after?
Right.
So
My personal opinion about the EU and its problems that it's going through right now are very similar to ones that I think we actually have here.
Okay.
I'm a huge dependency concerns me, specifically foreign dependency. Why that has not been the number one issue talked about during my lifetime, and we don't have enough time to get into it. Our dependency on foreign oil, dependency on foreign anything,
right,
is always a security threat. And I think, you know, Russia's playing a card that's long since has probably overdue. And I don't support their efforts necessarily, but anybody who didn't see this coming has blinders on. And we're in a very similar situation with our dependency on Saudi Arabia. I hate to bring that up, but that's kind of what compels a lot of my narrative is it's not that fossil fuels and renewables are necessarily exclusive of each other, but the more you can aggregate these things successively together and have your own independent energy conglomerate, the more you're going to be able to avoid EU type situations. And I think they're witnessing their imbalance is you're too heavily dependent upon one source of energy from another location, and now you're feeling it. And we have had that perpetually in the United States. When my kids were watching the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan on the news, and Dad asked me, Dad, why are we pulling out? I said, the question you need to be asking is, when will we be going back? And it's because of this stranglehold that, you know, that the East has on us. And I'm getting way off topic, I know, but
well, what's $80 billion worth of equipment between friends?
Yeah.
Go figure that one out. But when we sit back and go, we can either follow what the EU is doing. I mean, take a look at the UK with England. They are having so many energy companies going out of business. And I believe yesterday they just announced that they have to print a bunch of extra money to give to the power companies because they don't have enough. The energy poor is coming on really, really hard. And so we got to avoid that at all costs. We can't get to that point.
You know, we have to have, you got to have economic frameworks in place for transition first. And I think it's really unfortunate that in a lot of areas in in global society or in economics, we always seem to put the cart before the horse, and the horse is a long time catching up, and it's a very painful path to walk. And, you know, I think some of the initiatives that you've seen in the EU, some of the initiatives that you see here, these very aggressive shifts towards, not to make renewables the go-to topic, but that's usually what we see. We find out this stuff is really expensive. We should have been slower in that transition. We should have let the markets develop slowly over time before we actually feel it all at once, if that makes sense.
It does.
Makes sense.
When now I apologize, but coal is making a comeback. I mean, it is absolutely going nuts, and it's because the you know, China is still building 4 a month or whatever the number is. I need to go
Yeah.
check the number. The UK and the EU are firing up. They're now moving their coal plants to oil because oil's cheaper than coal. Holy
Yeah.
smokes. Now, do you work with any of the power companies using coal?
Yes.
What can you do for them? Same thing?
Same thing. In fact, I think coal is, and that's kind of one of our alphas at US carbon captures, while so much of the world, and we can get into maybe the technical differences, and they're big for so much of the country. Some of these leaders that you talk about
Right.
are heading for what I call low hanging fruit. Your amine plants around natural gas processing facilities in the Haynesville and ethanol plants in the Midwest
Right.
that have 99% pure CO2. It's easy pickings. It's
Right.
easy to put in a pipe. You dehydrate it, you compress it, you can get it out of there.
Nice.
It's not going to really help sustain the energy infrastructure, as well as implementing carbon capture with coal-fired power plants for the points that you just raised. Is despite the attack or the black eye, to use your words, that fossil fuels have,
Right.
we cannot wean ourselves off of coal for the reasons you just said. You light it on
Right.
fire, it burns really well. It's economic, and the rest of the world is continuing to use it.
Yes.
And so you're going to very quickly find yourself in an economic debacle,
Right.
competing with the East that continues to use this source. And so
Right.
I would say, in answer to your question, coal fire generated anything
Right.
has got 100% of our attention, because you're right. Short contracts on coal are up, not down.
Right.
Despite what you're reading in the media about how evil it is,
Right.
those coal cars are rolling more now than ever. And I
Oh,
think that's probably a good thing. What we need to do is find out how to capture the emissions they're putting out, not get rid of that source,
right.
rid of the harmful effects.
Right. Okay. I have a passion for getting power to everybody.
Right.
What if we changed? And Jonathan, if you went out and really articulated, rather than forcing the higher cost of an unplanned renewable only, because you got to have storage then, just
Yeah.
like we
Battery life.
found in
Right.
Texas.
Transmission. You got to have transmission, which is a huge problem down here.
Oh, yeah. So this is not a discussion of going renewable or not. I think we should when the technology is there. But what about focusing on trying to articulate to folks, let's let Africa, let's let these other folks, not let, but let's encourage, but we can teach them what you, Jonathan, are espousing and learning here. Wouldn't that seem to make more sense that we elevate them out of poverty with what you've learned? Boy, you espoused
Absolutely.
on that answer. Yes.
Absolutely. I'm not even going to expand on what you just said. I completely agree with what you just said.
Okay.
And I think, again, very quickly you can get off topic, but I think eradication of poverty is numero uno. We've got
Right.
a lot of satellite initiatives, but it is the rising tide that lifts all boats. You want to improve anything about a particular reason, raise the GDP, period. Right. At least that's my opinion.
Yes.
And I study economics, and I believe in some of that theory. But I think education on how all these countries can,
Yep.
certainly underdeveloped countries, can avail themselves of this technology and keep using the fossil fuel sources that they have readily available. Because if we have transmission problems and renewal problems in the EU and America,
right,
then how can you implement this on developed worlds?
You can't.
You just can't do it.
Now, here's something. Okay, let's get all excited here and everything else. So, the world is in a financial crunch because let's go back to the invest. We're going to circle back to the investing for just a sec.
You bet.
Everybody invested in printed money. As an economist and you're studying econ, if money is being printed, there's an oversupply of money, inflation normally happens, right?
Right.
So if we're the world is facing inflation, wouldn't it make sense for us to go low cost coal, low cost natural gas, and put carbon capture on it and not print as much money?
I think I just found my new business slogan.
What's that?
What you just said, wouldn't it make sense to implement carbon capture, keep using low cost fuels rather
Yeah.
than affecting our currencies? I completely agree. We can solve the global economy by the implementation of carbon capture is what I just heard. And I agree with you.
Wow. See, I'm over here being your biggest cheerleader, not just because we're buddies out of
Yeah.
Oklahoma City
Oklahoma
University.
City. Yeah.
Well, that's cool. I really am appreciating the stair stepping on you taking us through this. And carbon capture, I always thought, okay, great. This is some kind of hokey pokey until you get into the nuts and bolts and why, and the fact that it
Right.
can be used for things that
Mhm.
to me is just as important.
Right. Well, it does have and has had, for lack of a better word, maybe a snake oil aura about it, because you
Right.
could very readily suggest, well, if it has so much utility, then how come we don't see it being done?
Right.
And there is, you can hear the crickets chirping at times. Well, dot dot dot. And I do believe it comes down to the fact that it's really expensive. I think there's a great deal of, and I don't think that story is yet to be completed yet.
Right.
Does industrial CO2 actually contribute to climate change? I think that narrative is still ongoing. I think one side's probably got a little bit more of the microphone than the other. But I
Right.
think one of the reasons you don't see maybe as much deployment over the years is that science is still in development. Is it
Right.
going to make a difference?
Great
Are
point.
we going to be able to capture 100% of this emission stream and the needle not continue, the needle
Right.
continue to climb?
Well, the CO2, I interviewed Gregory Wrightstone several times, and he's over there saying, hey, carbon emissions are great because the plants love it, and
Yeah.
he's got some science. He's totally the other way. He says totally, and I really respect his stats and numbers and everything else. And so it's nice to hear his side of it, and he gets canceled on social media a lot.
Oh, I'll bet. Yeah. Well, as we approach the last, what I think are 10 minutes, it's a difficult time to move intelligent solutions forward because
Right.
cancel culture affects everybody. It's
Right.
toxic. And if there's a number other than poverty, and we see this affecting all things, there's been a lot of exciting and intelligent
Right.
awakening, whether it's good or bad. We've got problems in this state, in other areas besides energy. We've got safety issues in our public schools.
Right.
We've got some, abortion laws have changed. These are important topics. You can't have intelligent conversations if everybody's afraid of being shut out. And
Exactly.
that is, I had lunch with a very respected financier about 2 weeks ago at the Petroleum Club in Dallas. And
Nice.
third sentence into this, the guy says, "I just want to let you know before we get started that I'm a Democrat." And I said, "The fact that you just said that to me and felt obligated to say so breaks my heart, because
Right.
I honestly don't care. That actually excites me because it's been a long time since I've had a conversation with somebody with differing political views than I have.
Right.
And I think that's the foundation of our country. That
Exactly.
should get every topic of conversation. But cancel culture, that's got to be public enemy number one, or we're not moving these serious issues anywhere."
Back in Oklahoma, when in the day, I have to respect the Democrats, and because you couldn't tell between a Democrat and a Republican, old school Oklahoma. I
Yeah.
really like that. It was about the individual. I worked with a bunch of them and the Democrats and everything else, and it where it went nationally, it's a whole different animal.
I was raised in the Democratic House. Both my parents are Democrat. All my friends' parents were Republican. And you
Yep.
line them up and have a conversation, and you really couldn't tell.
But it was absolutely important to have the two-side discussion.
To have the conversation for the furtherance of the common good of the country, not the furtherance
Exactly.
of each one's individual lobby. And I don't know
Yep.
where we went off on this tangent, but we really need to start working to pull it back for the
Oh
sake of
yeah.
this.
get rid of the right, totally the right, get rid of the total left, and let's do it like it used to be. I mean, anyway, that's my 2 cents there for
Yeah, likewise, I agree. I'm the same way.
But okay, so what are your next steps, Johnathan? I'm over here, your biggest cheerleader and everything else, but
Yeah.
what are your next steps?
In the carbon capture area right now, the main step is the main obstacle or objective is really developing intelligent conversations with the people that are putting emissions into the atmosphere.
Oh, yeah.
Is there seems to be a hands raised up. We don't have the solution. We're getting enormous pressure from, potentially from the SEC, which scares a lot of people, and I think it should.
Right.
Although the EPA versus West Virginia is kind of viewed as a stumble for the federal government, there's more oversight and regulatory pressure coming on emitters. Right. The financial pressure just continues to go up. Is convincing them, listen, carbon capture is real. It's possible. Yeah. You're right. It's expensive. You're right. It's going to add things and take away in others. But you can make a decision. This is a solution that's here. You don't have to worry about retrofitting your plant or shutting it down completely.
Right.
And it's not just power plants, concrete, steel, anything that burns biomatter creates heat or energy. You got a carbon emission problem and you need to find a solution. And there's companies like ours, but there's lots of good companies out there doing this work. And I hope that conversation continues to elevate.
People don't really get the amount of coal used in order to get cement. All these big cement projects around, you have to use coal. It's the only thing that'll get it to a certain temperature to make cement.
That's right. Whether you drive an EV or a petroleum-driven combustible engine, you're driving on asphalt and street that's got to be made burning coal.
Right.
And the steel frames inside your door panels, that's coming from steel, and it's either coming here or from China. And if you want it built here, we're going to have to capture the carbon dioxide and do something with it.
Well, I'll tell you what, I really want to have another discussion with you. In fact, my head's already spinning because I got a panel that I want to put you on coming up here as an industry expert. So we're going to have some more good discussions, and I just really appreciate you. One last thing, I want all of our listeners, like I said, both my fans, but if you're listening on the podcast, this is not going to make sense. But if you're looking at us on video, there's a mountain lion hanging over Johnathan's shoulder. But I want to let you know there was no animals harmed in this.
Yes, that's right.
Of this. You want to tell us how you got him?
That's a very good point. I've been an outdoorsman my whole life and love all things wild about the state of Texas. This came from a collector. This mountain lion died on the King Ranch and was killed by a lightning bolt 15 years ago. And when I started, I told you earlier the story, I found it at an estate sale. And when I was first starting my business in the Texas Panhandle, didn't know anybody, was going to a lot of trade shows. I put this in the front window of our building, of our office, and I took it with me to oil and gas trade shows and just put it out there on my table. And whether they wanted our services or not, whether they wanted to meet me or not, became irrelevant because they asked me the story about this mountain lion. And when I was done, I handed them a business card. And that's how a company got off the ground 18 years ago.
I'm dumb enough that I would put a leash on that thing and pretend I'm dragging it. I'd put wheels on it and drag it around, taking it for a walk. So, I absolutely love that. Well, last word, Johnathan, and we're going to cut out here. Last word.
Well, I really appreciate you giving me the time, Stu. I hope everybody listening realizes that we've got a national initiative that involves all hands on deck, all energy sources, to make a more reliable energy infrastructure for future generations. And I hope U.S. carbon capture and everybody involved in carbon capture can be a part of that story.
Well, Johnathan, as the CEO of U.S. Carbon Capture, I just appreciate you stopping by the podcast, and I can't wait to have dinner with you.
So, all right, I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks. Talk to you soon.